The machine nobody believed in. The first tractor sank just after sunrise. Not completely, just enough. Its rear tires disappeared into the mud until the machine leaned at an awkward angle, engines straining, wheels spinning uselessly. The sound carried across the field like a warning. A few hundred yards away, Caleb Mercer shut off his own tractor and climbed down into ankle-deep water. The wheat should have been harvested 2 weeks ago. Instead, it stood under a sky that seemed unable to make up its mind. Rain had come almost every day for nearly a month. Not violent storms, just steady, stubborn rain that soaked the soil deeper with each passing day. Caleb wiped moisture from his brow and stared across the fields. The crop was beginning to bend. Another week, and much of it would be worthless. By mid-morning, farmers from around the valley had gathered near the edge of the property. Some stood in work boots coated with mud. Others sat on truck tailgates drinking coffee from thermoses. Nobody talked much. They all knew the numbers: seed costs, fuel costs, equipment payments, bank loans. A failed harvest wasn't just a bad season. For some families, it could become the beginning of the end. The trapped tractor remained motionless in the field like a stranded animal. "We can't keep doing this," someone muttered. Nobody disagreed. The meeting later that afternoon took place inside the Grange Hall, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of old wood and damp jackets. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A county agriculture advisor stood near a whiteboard, listing possible solutions. Most had already been attempted. Lighter equipment, alternative routes, modified tire pressure, nothing worked for long. Every suggestion seemed to collapse under the same reality. The ground was simply too wet. Near the back of the room sat Walter Hayes. Most people barely noticed him. At 72, Walter had become something of a local curiosity. His farm sat on the northern edge of the valley, hidden behind rows of cottonwoods and rusting fences. Passing drivers often slowed to stare at the maze of machinery scattered across his property. Old combines, truck frames, engines missing parts, stacks of gears, axles, chains, pieces of equipment that looked decades past saving. Children called it the scrap farm. Adults usually called it something less polite. Walter never seemed bothered. He sat quietly now, hands folded around a coffee cup, listening, watching, waiting. The discussion dragged on. Voices rose and fell. Frustration filled the room. Eventually, someone asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What happens if we can't get the crop out? Silence settled over the hall. Not dramatic silence, the practical kind, the kind that appears when everyone already knows the answer. A harvest left in the field too long would rot. Walter looked down at his coffee. Then he cleared his throat. The sound was so unexpected that several heads turned. "I might have something," he said. The room waited. Walter wasn't known for speaking often. Caleb glanced toward him. "What kind of something?" Walter hesitated, as if reconsidering whether he should have spoken at all. Then he answered, "A machine." A few people exchanged looks. Someone near the front chuckled. Not cruelly, just automatically. Walter noticed. So did everyone else. "What kind of machine?" Caleb asked. Walter stared briefly toward the rain-covered window. "Built it myself." The chuckle became a few scattered smiles. Not because they disliked him, because they knew Walter. For years, strange mechanical projects had appeared and disappeared around his property. Homemade attachments, modified engines, experimental equipment. Most people assumed they never worked. Walter shifted in his chair. "It's designed for soft ground." The advisor frowned. "You built a harvesting machine?" "Not exactly." "Then what is it?" Walter opened his mouth, stopped, closed it again. Finding the words seemed harder than building the machine itself. Finally he said, "It's complicated." That earned another smile from someone in the room. The meeting moved on. No arguments, no insults, just quiet dismissal. The kind that hurts more because nobody intends it to. By evening, the rain had finally stopped. Low clouds drifted over the valley, while fading sunlight reflected off standing water between rows of wheat. Walter drove home alone. His pickup rattled over gravel roads bordered by soaked fields. The windshield wipers squeaked occasionally despite the dry glass. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, said nothing. There was nobody to talk to anyway. When he reached his farm, he parked beside an aging red barn. The property looked exactly as people described it. Rust everywhere, metal everywhere, decades of machinery scattered across acres of ground. But beneath the apparent disorder existed a logic only Walter understood. Every piece had a purpose. Every salvaged component had been saved for a reason. He stepped into the barn. Dust floated through shafts of evening light. The interior smelled of oil, steel, and old timber. At the far end sat the machine, half hidden beneath tarps. Walter stood motionless for several seconds. Then he pulled the covers away. The machine looked strange even to him. Wide flotation wheels, custom suspension, an unusual frame assembled from parts originating from half a dozen different machines. Hydraulic systems wound through its body like veins. Years of labor stood silently before him. Years of mistakes, failures, redesigns. Long nights spent welding alone. Walter reached out and rested a hand against the metal. The steel felt cool. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside the barn, only the faint ticking of cooling metal could be heard. For a moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Maybe the others were right. Maybe the machine was ridiculous. Maybe 15 years had been wasted chasing an idea nobody needed. Then his eyes settled on a faded photograph attached near the workbench. An old photograph. 2 young men standing beside a tractor. Brothers. Walter looked away quickly. The familiar ache returned. Still there after all these years. Still unfinished. The machine wasn't just metal. It never had been. He climbed into the operator's seat, turned the ignition. The starter groaned. Once, twice. Then the engine erupted with a rough cough. The barn filled with vibration. Dust drifted from the rafters. Walter listened carefully. Every sound mattered. Every rattle had meaning. Gradually, the engine settled into a deep, steady rhythm. Not perfect, but alive. Outside, darkness gathered across the valley. Tomorrow morning, the farmers would be waiting. Most expected failure. Some expected entertainment. Very few expected anything else. Walter sat behind the controls, staring through the open barn doors toward the distant fields. For the first time in a long while, he felt nervous. Not because the machine might fail, because it might finally work, and if it did, he would have to explain why he built it in the first place. What the machine was really built for. The machine reached the flooded field just after dawn. A crowd had already gathered along the gravel road. Pickup trucks lined the ditch. Farmers leaned against tailgates with folded arms. Some carried coffee cups. Others simply watched through narrowed eyes, unsure whether they were witnessing a solution or a very public mistake. The morning air smelled of wet earth and diesel fuel. Mist hovered low over the wheat. Walter guided the machine slowly down a muddy access path. The engine produced a deep mechanical hum unlike anything else in the valley. Not loud, just unfamiliar. People stepped aside as it passed. Caleb Mercer watched closely. The machine looked even stranger in daylight. The oversized wheels seemed too wide. The frame set unusually low. Hydraulic arms moved subtly as the machine adjusted to the uneven ground. Nothing about it looked factory-built. Yet somehow it appeared purposeful, as though every odd detail existed for a reason. Walter stopped at the edge of the field. For a long moment he remained seated, looking ahead, calculating. The ground before him resembled a shallow swamp more than farmland. Water reflected the gray sky between rows of wheat. Several pieces of equipment remained stranded where operators had abandoned them days earlier. Caleb walked over. "You sure about this?" Walter didn't answer immediately. His weathered hands rested on the controls. "No." Caleb laughed softly. At least that sounded honest. Walter eased the machine forward. The front wheels entered the mud. Everyone watched. The machine dipped slightly, then continued. No spinning tires, no sudden sinking, just steady movement. 10 yards, 20, 30. The machine crossed ground that had trapped equipment 3 times its size. A murmur spread through the crowd. Nobody cheered. Not yet. Farmers were practical people. They trusted results, not optimism. But something had changed. The doubt was beginning to crack. By afternoon, the machine was operating across several sections of flooded farmland. Word traveled quickly. People who hadn't attended the morning demonstration arrived to see it themselves. The reactions were remarkably similar. Confusion first, then curiosity, then cautious hope. Walter ignored most of the attention. He focused entirely on the machine, listening, adjusting, monitoring temperatures and pressures. Years of experience had taught him that success often created its own problems. Machines rarely failed when convenient. Near sunset, the first problem appeared. A hydraulic hose ruptured. Fluid sprayed across the frame. The machine shuddered and stopped. The crowd that had formed throughout the day grew quiet, not disappointed, concerned. Walter climbed down immediately, without panic, without frustration. as if breakdowns were simply another part of the conversation, because to him, they were. He opened a side panel and examined the damage. Before he could retrieve tools, someone approached. It was Ethan Walker, 26 years old, recently returned to the valley after several years working in agricultural equipment repair. Walter knew him only in passing. Ethan crouched beside the machine. "Need a hand?" Walter glanced at him. Most younger mechanics preferred newer equipment, computers, sensors, factory diagnostics, not homemade machinery built from salvaged parts. "You know hydraulics?" "A little." Walter handed him a wrench. The repair took less than 40 minutes. As darkness settled across the fields, they worked beneath portable lights powered by a generator. For the first time in years, Walter wasn't repairing the machine alone. Neither man mentioned it, but both noticed. The following days became a race against time. Every morning before sunrise, the machine entered the fields. Every night, it returned coated in mud. Progress was slow but steady, and with every acre recovered, people's attitudes shifted further. Farmers who had once joked about Walter's scrap collection now stopped by with spare parts. Some brought food, others offered labor. One evening, Caleb arrived carrying a box of bearings. "Figured you might need these." Walter accepted them. "Thanks," that was all. Yet it felt significant. Mutual respect rarely arrived with speeches. Usually it arrived in cardboard boxes and practical gestures. One night, after another long day in the fields, Ethan remained behind while others headed home. The machine sat inside Walter's barn, partially disassembled for maintenance. Rain tapped gently against the roof. Walter worked beneath a hanging work light. Ethan studied the machine. The more he looked, the more questions appeared. Certain components seemed older than the rest. Some sections showed decades of wear. Others looked comparatively new. It wasn't one project. It was many projects layered on top of each other. Eventually, Ethan spoke. "How long have you been building this thing?" Walter tightened a bolt. "Depends what you mean." Ethan smiled. "I mean exactly what I asked." Walter continued working. Several seconds passed. Then he answered quietly. 15 years. Ethan stopped. 15? Walter nodded. The answer didn't make sense. Nobody spent 15 years building a machine they weren't planning to sell, or patent, or profit from somehow. Ethan waited. Walter rarely volunteered information, but something about the late hour made conversation easier. Maybe exhaustion lowered defenses. Maybe the machine itself invited honesty. Finally, Walter sat down on a nearby stool. His eyes settled somewhere beyond the barn wall, somewhere years away. "My brother used to farm with me." Ethan remained silent. Walter continued. "His name was Daniel." The words emerged slowly, as if they hadn't been spoken often. "There was a flood season, long time ago. Outside, rain intensified briefly, before easing again. Walter's gaze never moved. We were trying to get equipment through fields that had no business holding equipment." A faint smile crossed his face. Not from happiness, from memory. "We thought we could beat the weather." The smile disappeared. "We couldn't." Ethan listened. Walter's hands remained folded together. Still, there was an accident. Nothing more needed to be said. The weight inside those 3 words filled the room. Ethan understood immediately. Walter stared at the concrete floor. For years, he'd replayed that season in his mind. Different decisions, different routes, different outcomes, all impossible now. If we'd had something that could move through conditions like this, he stopped. The unfinished sentence lingered. The machine wasn't a hobby. It wasn't an invention. It was a promise made too late. Walter looked toward the machine. Every welded joint, every modified component, every redesign, all connected to a moment he had never truly left behind. For years, people had assumed he was collecting junk. In reality, he had been building an answer to a question that haunted him. What if there had been another way? Neither man spoke for a while. The rain continued overhead. Metal cooled with occasional ticking sounds. Finally, Ethan stood. "We should get some rest." Walter nodded. As they prepared to leave, a sharp metallic crack echoed through the barn. Both men froze. A support component near the machine's rear assembly had fractured under stress from the previous day's work. Walter examined the damage. His expression changed immediately. This wasn't a minor repair. Without that part, the machine couldn't return to the fields. And outside, beyond the barn walls, Fresh storm clouds were already gathering over the valley. According to the forecast, heavy rain would arrive within 24 hours. Thousands of acres remained unharvested, and for the first time since the machine began proving itself, Walter wasn't sure they had enough time left. The harvest they saved together. Walter barely slept. The fractured support assembly sat on a workbench beneath a harsh fluorescent light, looking far smaller than the problem it had created. Outside, the wind had changed direction. That worried him more than the broken metal. Farmers paid attention to wind. After enough years, certain shifts became impossible to ignore. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. Just before sunrise, Walter stepped outside carrying a mug of coffee. Low clouds stretched across the valley like a gray blanket. The air felt heavy, charged with moisture. He looked toward the distant fields. Too much wheat remained standing. Too much depended on one machine. Behind him, tires crunched over gravel. Walter turned. A pickup truck pulled into the yard, then another and another. Within minutes, vehicles began arriving from every direction. Caleb Mercer climbed out first. Behind him came Ethan, then several neighboring farmers, a local mechanic, 2 welders from town, even people Walter barely knew. He frowned. "What are you all doing here?" Caleb shrugged. "Working." Walter looked confused. "The machine's down." "That's why we're here." Nobody delivered a speech. Nobody announced a grand plan. People simply started unloading tools, generators, welding equipment, metal stock, replacement components, coffee, breakfast sandwiches wrapped in paper, practical solutions. The language farmers understood best. Walter stood quietly as activity spread across the yard. For years he had become accustomed to solving problems alone. The sight felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Ethan approached, carrying a blueprint-sized sheet of paper. Actually, it wasn't a blueprint. It was a hand-drawn diagram Walter had sketched years earlier. Ethan unfolded it across a workbench. "We can rebuild the assembly." Walter studied the drawing. "The original steel isn't available anymore." A welder named Frank spoke up from across the barn. "Good thing we're not using the original." Walter glanced over. Frank pointed towards several heavy steel beams lying on a trailer. "Stronger material." Another farmer added, "Took it off an old grain loader." Someone else contributed bearings. Another supplied hydraulic fittings. A retired machinist offered to fabricate replacement brackets. Piece by piece, the valley began donating itself to the repair. Walter watched the process unfold. Something inside him shifted. For years he had viewed the machine as a private burden, his responsibility, his unfinished business. Yet now dozens of hands moved around it, people measuring, cutting, grinding, welding, improving. The machine no longer belonged only to him. That felt right. By midday, sparks flew beneath the barn rafters. The smell of hot steel filled the air. Metal grinders screamed against reinforced components. Generators rumbled outside. Rain clouds continued gathering on the horizon. Everyone noticed them. Nobody mentioned them. There wasn't time. Hours passed. The machine slowly came back together. Not exactly as before. Better. Stronger. A reflection of many minds instead of one. Late that afternoon, Walter found himself standing beside Ethan near the rear assembly. The younger man wiped grease from his hands. "You know," Ethan said, "people are going to want copies of this design." Walter chuckled quietly. "Why?" Ethan stared at him. "Because it works." Walter looked across the barn. For a moment he saw something he hadn't expected. Young mechanics studying the machine's systems. Teenagers helping organize tools. Farmers discussing modifications and improvements. Knowledge moving from one generation to another. Not stored. Shared. The realization settled slowly. Maybe the machine had never been the real legacy. Maybe the ideas behind it mattered more. The lessons, the problem-solving, the refusal to give up on difficult questions. Years ago, Walter had started building the machine because of guilt. Now something different was emerging from it. Something larger than regret. By evening, the final bolts were tightened. The repaired machine sat in the center of the barn, silent, ready. Everyone stepped back, waiting. Walter climbed into the operator's seat, the same seat he had occupied hundreds of times before. Yet tonight felt different. The barn had become crowded. People stood along walls and workbenches. Nobody spoke. Not because they expected a dramatic moment, because they genuinely cared about the outcome. Walter inserted the key, turned it. The starter engaged. 1 second, 2. 3. Then the engine roared to life. A deep mechanical rhythm filled the building, steady, confident, stronger than before. Smiles appeared throughout the crowd. Relief spread quietly. Walter looked through the windshield. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone inside the machine. The next morning began before dawn. Harvest lights pierced the darkness across the valley. The repaired machine rolled into the fields, accompanied by tractors, grain carts, and crews working on every remaining acre. The storm front was visible now, dark clouds advancing steadily from the west. The race had begun. Hour after hour, machinery moved across the landscape. Engines growled, grain poured into trailers, radios crackled with updates. Workers rotated shifts. Nobody wanted to stop. Nobody needed motivation. The approaching weather provided enough. As daylight faded, the horizon darkened further. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Still they worked. Field after field disappeared beneath harvesting equipment. The machine Walter had built led the effort through the wettest sections where conventional equipment still struggled. Near midnight, the final acreage remained. Exhaustion showed on every face. Mud-coated boots, hands ached, eyes burned from long hours. Yet nobody left. At 2:17 a.m., the last section of wheat entered the harvest stream. A cheer rose from somewhere across the field. Not loud, not organized, just genuine. People waving flashlights, patting backs, exhaling weeks of tension. Minutes later, the first raindrops began falling. The storm had arrived, but it was too late. The harvest was already safe. Weeks passed. Autumn settled over the valley. The fields changed from gold to brown. Life gradually returned to normal. One Saturday afternoon, a crowd gathered at an old maintenance building near town. The structure had been renovated during the weeks following harvest. Inside stood the machine, cleaned, repainted, maintained, ready for future seasons. Hayes Field Recovery System, built from what others threw away. Visitors walked through the workshop. Students asked questions. Farmers studied diagrams mounted on the walls. Several younger mechanics had already begun building improved versions. Walter sat outside on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree whose leaves had turned deep orange. He watched people come and go, listened to distant conversations, observed children, pointing excitedly toward components they didn't yet understand. The afternoon sunlight felt warm against his face. At some point, Ethan stepped outside. He sat beside Walter. Neither spoke immediately. There wasn't much left to say. Eventually, Ethan nodded toward the workshop. Quite a crowd. Walter smiled. A small smile, the kind that arrives naturally. Yeah. For a while, they listened to the wind moving through the trees. Then, from inside the building, the machine started. Its familiar rumble drifted across the yard. Walter closed his eyes briefly, not because he was remembering the past, because for the first time, he wasn't trapped inside it. Years earlier, he had begun building the machine in response to a loss he could never undo. He believed he was trying to save a harvest that had already disappeared. In truth, he had been building a bridge, one that connected grief to purpose, experience to youth, isolation to community. The machine had saved the valley's harvest, but standing there now, Walter understood something else. The people had saved him too. And as the engine's steady rhythm echoed through the autumn afternoon, he realized that some legacies are not measured by what a person builds. They're measured by what continues after they're gone. The season after, winter arrived slowly in the valley. The fields rested beneath a thin layer of frost. Harvest equipment sat parked inside sheds. Irrigation canals moved quietly beneath pale morning skies. For the first time in months, nobody was racing against weather. Nobody was watching forecasts every hour. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, or at least, most people thought it had. Walter Hayes still woke before sunrise. Old habits rarely disappeared. Each morning he pulled on the same work jacket, brewed the same strong coffee, and stepped outside to inspect his property. The scrap farm looked different now, not physically. The same rusted machinery still occupied the same places. The same weathered barns stood beneath the same cottonwood trees. But people no longer drove past it laughing. Now they stopped. That was new. A local high school agriculture teacher brought students for occasional visits. Young mechanics appeared with notebooks. Farmers from neighboring counties arrived asking questions. Sometimes they wanted advice. Sometimes they wanted to study parts of the machine. Sometimes they simply wanted to meet the man who had built it. Walter never seemed entirely comfortable with the attention. Years of solitude don't disappear overnight. Still, he tried. One cold January morning, Ethan arrived carrying a cardboard box. Walter was repairing an old hydraulic pump when the younger man entered the barn. "What have you got there?" Ethan set the box on a workbench. "Something you should see." Walter opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs. Some were printed from newspapers. Others had been taken by local residents during the harvest. Pictures showed the machine crossing flooded fields, crews working beneath portable lights, farmers gathered around repair stations, children climbing onto equipment after the season ended. Walter studied them silently. The photographs captured moments he barely remembered experiencing. At the time, there had been no opportunity to pause and appreciate anything. Everyone had been focused on surviving the season. Ethan picked up one image. It showed a group of farmers rebuilding the machine inside the barn. "What do you notice?" Walter examined the picture. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he realized something. Nobody in the photo was standing around. Everyone was working. Everyone contributed. Nobody appeared more important than anyone else. The machine occupied the center. The people surrounded it, together. Walter stared at the image longer than the others. "Funny," he said quietly. "What? I spent years thinking I built that machine." Ethan smiled. "And now?" Walter looked around the barn, at the tools, at the parts, at the shelves filled with projects. "Now I'm not so sure." The months passed. Spring eventually arrived. Snow melted from distant hills. Tractors returned to the fields. Fresh planting began. The valley moved forward. One afternoon, Walter received an unexpected invitation. The county fair board wanted him to attend an agricultural innovation exhibition. His first instinct was to decline. Crowds weren't his thing. Neither were ceremonies, especially ceremonies involving him. But Ethan refused to let him avoid it. "You're going." "No." "Yes. I don't need to." "You really do." Several weeks later, Walter found himself standing inside a large exhibition building filled with farming equipment. Manufacturers displayed shiny new machinery. Representatives delivered presentations. Visitors moved between exhibits. Walter felt completely out of place. Then he noticed something unexpected. Near the center of the building stood a display featuring several machines inspired by his design. Not copies, evolutions. Different engineers had adapted concepts from the Hayes field recovery system, improved flotation systems, new suspension designs, enhanced traction mechanisms. The ideas were spreading, growing, changing. One engineer approached him, then another. Soon a small group gathered. They asked technical questions, shared modifications, discussed future improvements. For nearly 2 hours, Walter forgot to be uncomfortable. The conversations reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. Not regret, not responsibility, simple curiosity. The same feeling that had led him to take apart old machinery as a teenager. The same feeling that had driven him to keep experimenting long after others stopped paying attention. As the day ended, Walter wandered outside. The fairgrounds were beginning to empty. Sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. He sat on a bench near the entrance, watching another generation arrive. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look tired." Walter glanced up. Caleb Mercer stood nearby, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Walter accepted one. "Long day." Caleb nodded. For a few minutes they sat quietly. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually Caleb spoke. "You know, I was wrong about you." Walter chuckled. "You'll need to be more specific." "The machine." Walter took a sip of coffee. Caleb continued. "I thought it was just another project. A lot of people did." "Yeah." The 2 men watched the sunset. Then Caleb added something unexpected. "My son wants to study agricultural engineering now." Walter looked over. "Really?" He saw what happened during the harvest. Caleb smiled faintly. "Says he wants to build things that solve problems." For a moment neither spoke. The statement settled gently between them. A simple sentence. Yet somehow it carried enormous weight, because legacy rarely announces itself. Most of the time it arrives quietly, through influence, through example, through ideas passed from one person to another. Months later, as another growing season took shape across the valley, Walter visited the community workshop. The building buzzed with activity. Students worked on projects, mechanics tested equipment, farmers exchanged ideas. The machine sat in its usual place, maintained, respected, useful, but no longer unique. Around it stood several newer designs inspired by its principles. The future had already begun. Walter walked slowly through the building, listening, observing, learning. At one workbench, two teenagers debated different suspension configurations. At another, a retired mechanic offered advice. Knowledge flowed in every direction. Nobody owned it. Everyone shared it. Walter paused beside a window overlooking the fields beyond town. Green shoots had begun emerging from the soil. Another season, another chance, another beginning. For years he had believed his story was about a machine. Then he thought it was about a harvest. Only now did he understand. It had always been about people. The machine was merely the thing that brought them together. And standing there, surrounded by conversation, invention, and possibility, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced for a very long time. Not relief, not pride, peace. The kind that arrives when a person finally understands that their work no longer depends on them alone. Outside, spring wind moved across the valley. Inside, the next generation kept building.